below. And again, keeping up the content schedule. But today, just doing something different. We'll check out RFK Stadium, and then we'll walk through some of the Lincoln Park and whatnot to Union Station. Maybe we'll walk by the Supreme Court. We'll see. But I will say, given that RFK Stadium is going to get blown up, maybe this will become a historical archive. I think one of the Collison brothers, I think the more obviously Irish Collison bro, had a great tweet. Something along the lines of, he realized how much passion things take to happen, and therefore the world is just a monument to passion projects, which I just think is a great sentiment. Very respectable. And certainly, I imagine RFK Stadium was somebody's passion project to that effect, or affect. But it must be torn down in the name of Josh Harris and the Commanders. As you see there, right. Yeah. But as you can see, the bones on RFK right there. I'm not sure how far into the demolition they've gotten, but it seems like a good shot with the sun. But of course, the entire gimmick with the stadium is that it's gonna be part of a bigger restructuring. I forget how much public funding they're getting, but I think it's enough for there to be a lot of hand-wringing. Probably some non-affordable housing type of argument, but of course, given what it is now, which is literally a husk, it's not, I think for the prior video, where he made the argument how disingenuous, I think the Brett Kavanaugh, Jerome Powell video, where it's a bit disingenuous to claim that, or at least the logical argument against density is kind of not as authentic or legit. I certainly think some of the RFK argument falls into that bucket. But so I guess they have done some demolition. It looks like. Yeah, it looks like it, right? You see the fancy camera work, zooming stuff. If I was better, I would fix the camera to be a bit more responsive. But And there's surely no asbestos in the air or stuff like that. Right. Surely not. Yeah. I don't know. It does seem pretty blown up, if you ask me. Yeah. So I'm not sure how much of the top of the structure was destroyed before, because I was here a couple weeks ago. And I do not recall it being as blown up back then. So I'm not sure how much has been done. I think if you look at the commander's timetable, it is a pretty aggressive one. You know. Oh, that's a good shot right there. Official team store next to all of that rubble. Unfortunately, RFK Stadium's not authentic enough, or by definition, an NFL franchise just lacks any type of actual sentiments or meaning, because by definition, an NFL franchise is literally a corporate socialist enterprise. Right. So it's not like if it would say like a football club like Brescia or Bordeaux, where there could actually be depth and meaning in the dissolution of its. So something like NFL. I think like literally Robert Kraft. It is so funny how heavy-handed CNBC isn't being anti-Zoran. Like I don't know. But like they had the Patriots owner Kraft. He said like the NFL is like a socialist enterprise. And they're like, you're gonna make. So I guess it's kind of funny, but I don't know. Surely the journalists should be impartial. Yeah, but these are the bones of RFK, and the broader point is, these are the bones of some history on these grounds, I suppose. And again, right, I think like the idea of things being people's passion projects, and with the National Cathedral and the Zuck Peter Thiel video, we had the idea of right, like if you work on a cathedral for that long, does it by extension become your passion project? I just suppose the NFL stadium is a bit less romantic, but it doesn't need to be romantic to be a passion project. But yeah, again, I do suppose it is nice that it is a big development, and again, in 10. Well, it's funny because the stadium is going to be built by 2030. Plus minus a couple years, and then, but the actual residential development won't happen until after the stadium is done and in practice, right? So, but again, like you can imagine the area looking much different than what it is currently. We could, but that's not what I was hoping to spend as much time talking about today. The big thing I want to talk about today is just risk-taking, risk-seeking, complain about a certain Oracle prediction market, not sure what order. I had a reasonably funny diatribe about Sam Bankman-Fried. Hopefully I won't forget. The other quirk I will say is that this is a National Guard base. And it turns out with all the National Guard in subways, they tend to use the restroom and they tend to sit in the back hallway. I had used the restroom at one of the stations last week. And dude, like some schmuck is taking a huge crap and made me wait 5 minutes. Very annoying. And then like they were literally chilling. Same with like a field trip. Like you would have like the bottle of water and all that. It was like literally like the same deal. The same deal where like in the back room, they literally had the Frito-Lay chips and all that. Like, come on, guys. That's not the productive use of whatever taxpayer funding. I do suppose taxpayer funding at the end of the day is the last of your concerns at a certain point. But anyways, back to the risk thing. So I guess we spent 10 minutes talking about those things. Not what I wanted to talk about when I was thinking about where to walk on a Friday. But risk. I suppose risk is a funnier concept where everybody has a different definition of it. That seems like a fancy car for National Guardsmen, if you're asking me. I don't know. Seems a bit too fancy for National Guard stuff, but who am I to say? But yeah, but risk, I think it's the same way like, if finance professionals talk about what is volatility, right? Is volatility the mark-to-market stock price? Is it more hidden? Right. You can have nuance about that. But risk is probably the more layperson's terminology for this type of concept. And if I think about, well, what does risk mean to you? I think somebody, you'll probably give credit to Howard Marks, just given how much he writes and, therefore he does have his stuff, right? So honestly, the same way like an LLM can pick up or identify somebody like Matt Levine or Janan Ganesh or like Patio 11 as a distinctive person that it recognizes in terms of their writing style. I imagine Howard Marks' memos are also in that category. But his point of risk was that it's just you have a wider range of outcomes, right? That's all risk means, right? Because his point was that like your expected return to risk chart is just a line that goes up, and his point was that that's true, but you need an error bar or a confidence interval around it, right? And the metaphor, not saying he said this, but his metaphor is that, right, you buy a 1-year treasury or a T-bill, whichever one's for the short dated, right, you buy a 1 year, and that one has that 5%, I guess 4.8% T-bill, right, should have, you'll get 4.8% plus your principal, right? No, or very little dispersion in what outcomes you can have, right? Whereas if you buy a hyperliquid token, which is gonna destroy USDC and Gemini, right? Your range of outcomes is probably much bigger to the upside and to the downside. And so that's what risk is. And you can apply the same metaphor about what risk is to other areas in life, right? Walking around or driving locally, right? Much lower band of outcomes than driving on a highway. Although I'm sure a car enthusiast could disagree with that. But I started thinking of my driving mishaps. It's like, well, yeah, I don't know. I suppose Maryland's a different setup. Right. But again, right, the point is just like risk is a real thing that you implicitly recognize and think about and internalize. Because I was thinking, there's different types of risk, right? There's financial risk, there's health risk, emotional risk, right? And so something I was thinking of is just because you can hear the concept of risk budgeting, right? Presumably people have different risk tolerances. If you have different risk tolerance, that implies that you have a certain risk budget. I was just thinking about, certainly in my own life, is would you have a different risk bucket for all of those different categories of risk? Or do you just view risk as like one thing? Or at the very least, if you just view your risk budget as one thing, right? And then if you spend your risk budget on financial risk, does that diminish your risk willingness for emotional risk, for other types of risk? Again, namely, to get to the short of it, to get to the punchline, right? It's like you spend all your time thinking about prediction markets and certain publicly listed securities, and then you are taking risk. You're taking risk in it is extremely tangible, right, and defined, right? You can see the dollar value. You are doing a physical action, right, of pushing some buttons or clicking some clicks to do the action. So it is so to me, it captures both the tangible action and something you remember, right? For example, jaywalking is not an example of that risk budget, I would say, right? It's physical, but you don't carry it with you. I don't recall, because I jaywalk every day to get to the subway stop, because the 3-minute light cycle is extremely inconvenient, objectively, right? So I'm not going to wait for a full cycle, But I don't perceive that as affecting my risk budget because I have no reason to remember it. I don't have any relic to carry with me. Whereas other types of risk, right, financial risk, you do carry with you, right? You do carry your P&L with you, or the artifacts of that trade with you. At the very least, you'll carry with you for a year when it comes time for tax season, as the last resort, implicitly. And on the other side of the spectrum, and again, right, I just like to complain and whine and talk about things that I like to whine and whinge and complain and talk about. It's not really complaining, it's more so just speaking random points that are probably just distillations, and inferior distillations at that, of somebody else's writing. Right, but when it comes to dating, right, presumably, it's not a risk in terms of bodily harm, or at least not if you're doing it in a non-threatening way. Hopefully you won't get maced. but you know, there is a risk budget implicit in that, right? And it does fit the criteria for what would count as that, the type of risk that would fit into your risk budget, right? Like it's a tangible action that you need to do something to do. The same way, like you'll click some buttons. Suppose in this case, you'll walk up to a girl and speak some words, right? So that's the physical action part, where you're doing something tangible, which makes like an actual action that's conscious. And then the other part, so naturally, you're gonna remember it, right? So, I certainly wouldn't remember those. Frankly, to some shame. Sometimes it'd be much easier. And back to risk. So the thesis point is: do you have one risk budget where all risks go into? And so if you spend all your risk budget on financial risk, does that demotivate you to take risk in other areas? I think in my case, what's most pertinent to me is dating risk, or just dating risk, for lack of a better word. I tend to think yes. There is one risk budget. Otherwise, I think conceptually, or certainly, again, conceptually, anybody who's young should be risk-seeking, and certainly financially, and certainly when it comes to, probably to a great degree, dating. Something I was thinking of, right, is like, I had a video where I complained about Oracle and not owning Oracle, or owning the Elliot Ellison prediction market for him to be the richest man in the world, right? And some of the logic goes, well, it's just asymmetric, bro. Like, certainly that prediction market was asymmetric, given the odds you could have bought it at. Right? It's like, well, why is it asymmetric? Because you could buy it at 1 cent, or like in de minimis territory, around like 3 cents per contract, including fees, right? Presumably Ellison, you know, he's one of the most underrated tech goat CEOs of his generation, you know. So presumably, you know, Ellison, right, who's dating a 30-year-old, and it's just like, you know, classic. He's certainly much more of a playboy or like Iron Man type compared to like most of the CEOs out there, like Zuck and all of them, right? Like, he certainly trumps them in that regard. Like, well, if that's the case, and so to recap the Oracle video, right, like, if I had a strong view that Ellison would be in the top 3 richest people, that's like, simplistically, from 3 to 1, it's not a huge delta. And if it's 3 to 1, like, again, a bit unfair, right? Because you have all of like the accounting shenanigans, how Forbes calculates it, and all that. And you can think, well, maybe Elon has a lot of crazy call options from all of his privates that can just do a bonkers raise at some point. It's like, but really thinking back on it, if Elon was going to do an XAI raise that increases his paper marks, wouldn't that AI boom help Oracle? Well, yes, I think so. You know, this is one example of a trade where I think Or I think I just didn't size it properly. It's certainly not to just inconsistencies in how you'd approach it. Anyways, I didn't rant about it in as much detail or pensiveness as I felt on Thursday, but right. But again, right. The point is like you can identify asymmetry, right? And generally speaking, asymmetric trades are pretty attractive, and you should be willing to take risk on asymmetric trades, right? It's probably not the best idea to take non-asymmetric risk, right? Where your risk-reward skew is not great, right? And of course, that's a finance concept or principle, but it can very much be applied to other types of risk, right? It's like when you think about dating, right? It's like if you're being first principles about it, I don't know. As far as I can tell, the upside do be pretty good when it comes to dating, right? Like it's certainly not the downside. I suppose if you get divorced, that's not great for your. That's not great. But presumably, like you're not gonna get to that phase for a bit. Right, it's like, I don't know, as far as I can tell, a couple benefits from that stuff. And the broad point is, like, part of me thinks that my risk budgeting is somewhat off tilt in terms of what I shouldn't allocate towards. I'm sure there's some psychologist who has a risk budgeting framework to think about. But the principle stands. Again, we'll say quickly on the broader point, just walking around and just seeing different areas. Like, I don't know, the vibe is different in the course of the walk, right? The vibe has just become different in such a short span. Which just gets to my point about what I think a pleasant city is like. Back to the PowerPoint. Asymmetry. Dating. Yeah. So yeah, I certainly think, yeah, so I think, and thinking about it, I should certainly ask someone who thinks of himself as being risk-seeking. In practice, I should be much more risk-seeking, including in dating, given that it is probably the greatest source of consternation in my everyday life, right? Like that line by the Pixies, like two lovers pass me by and intertwine, and now heaven knows I'm miserable. That's like, I get that. I appreciate the lyrical genius of the Pixies, you know. Let's go buy their royalties. Or something, you know, again. But with that, you know, it's, I don't know, you get the asymmetry part. But again, like the risk budgeting part, I guess if you practice it more, like the risk is less daunting, or the risk is less interesting, or doesn't feel as great, and therefore that fixes a lot. Like, I can get that point. It's a bit hard to have a unit of risk associated with it implicitly. For sure, certainly, it feels kind of dorkish But feels almost like one of those effective altruist types things to do, where they, you know, can slice and dice it in a like a rationalist way. I do suppose the fix is always tougher, but yeah. Because you could think one argument is that you could just do, if you treat it as just one risk budget, you could just do just do way less risk on stuff. I don't know, that seems kind of disappointing. It's fun to make a prediction on a Rotten Tomatoes score for a movie. Ironically enough, like Rotten Tomatoes scores are much better, in my view, than Spotify streaming. I think some of it is just, I think some of it's timing. I think the Spotify markets are 1 week in advance, whereas Rotten Tomatoes is like a month and a half or 2 months in advance. So A, you have more time, or A, that means there's more time delta when there is zero information, right? Because for the Spotify markets, like you'll know the first stream count on that Saturday after the Friday market gets posted. And so you have a week to operate in not perfect information, but you have an indication. Whereas your Rotten Tomato scores, you have an entire month where there's no new information. Like you can know about a guy's track record, who the actors are, but there is no information, and everybody has no information, which just means there's wider variance what the actual outcome can be for longer, and therefore pricing can be more attractive. Whereas the Spotify markets tend to be pretty pretty well marked in contrast. University of Georgia. I do suppose you're not a real university unless you have a DC outpost. Because how else would you know that your school has a... I do suppose it makes like the... it does make like your study abroad memos a bit easier when it's like, just study abroad in DC. It's not a state, it's a foreign country. Things work differently there. To that great quote about, you know, time and how the past is a foreign place. Great line. I say with deep wisdom, given my age, which is a bit depressing. But yeah, back on the dating point, you know, again, you know, so not for you as a viewer to read in between the lines of of the implications of what I'm saying, but it's just personally something I don't actively think about it, but it is something like fundamentally like I do think about risk. It's only personal risk in areas, and it's, I just suppose there's some dissonance that I'm not more risk seeking in certain areas or regards. But again, I don't know how you fix it. Probably, again, like the one fix is just take on more risk, and so certainly with Rotten Tomato markets, I become more willing to size things up over time, just because I've done it more, so I have like a record. I'm confident I'm not going to completely blow myself up in those markets. It's like, it's really like, I get back to like the PowerPoint of like things that take effort and you remember, and dating apps I don't think really count for any of that, right? Like sure, you're pushing buttons, but I think you probably come to the conclusion that it's a numbers game unless you're not being that conscious about it, is one thing. And the other thing is, so that's like the physical part. And the other part is, like, you just wouldn't remember much or any of it, you know? Like, unless you're screenshotting a complete baddie or something, you know, to use the lingo, right? Otherwise, you know, and that is relatively high effort, right? If you're actually going to screenshot a cute girl or something, right? Profile. So it's not like, and even then you're not going to remember it, right? Just like, so like dating app, it's almost, well, and that's only somebody appeal, right? Like, it is complete low risk, right? Because odds are it's not going to be that personally identifying, right? Which should help you. I just suppose if you're a guy, the risk is just being a manlet is a unfortunate byproduct. But I will say, this gas station or beer store has a very retro feel. Just appreciate it. Back to the park point. Yeah, so certainly you can say, like, well, we just use dating apps, and it doesn't really fit the risk budget because there is no risk implicit to it, right? Like, there's nothing involved in that, in my view at least. I mean, certainly as a guy, right? Like, you kind of, right? The reality or the purpose of dating apps is very different compared to if you were the opposite gender. I'm sure you could have some smart sounding line of, like, dating for men is on offense, whereas dating for women is on defense. Tips Hat writes PhD thesis on Matt's group demographics and how it's like 10-to-1 ratio or something horrible. We interrupt the scheduled programming. Look at the Heritage Foundation. These schmucks. They're so... Alright. I don't know. I'm not a fan, but look at this thing. I don't know. So self-important. They put up a fence. Incredible. It is, but it's not as off-putting as that victims of quote-unquote communism type memorial that's dumped on the highway. I'm not sure. Would you pay more to live in an apartment that's next to the Heritage Foundation? Probably not. Frankly, that'd be a miserable experience. Intellectually. To know you're literally living next to some of the worst people, or certainly worst thinkers in the U.S. We make a scheduled interruption to walk by the Federal Reserve. Now, of course, one of the funnier parts was that meeting with Trump and Powell when they walked through the construction site. So, you know, being risk-seeking, why not walk around a publicly accessible sidewalk where there is no risk? But anyway, dating apps. Yeah, so it's like dating apps, like I certainly don't perceive it as any risk. I certainly suppose there is some, like, emotional damage that comes from it if the hit rate is extremely marginal. And again, it should be. I fully accept that, you know. Wholly accept that. But yeah, so like, if that's, yeah, the joke is, like, there's only two ways you can meet people to date. Right? It's like it can either be online or in person. They're like, can't really argue against that, can you? No. Yeah, I'm 90% sure this is the Fed building. Let's double check. I know the SEC is, this is the court building. Never mind, this is not the Treasury. But again, right, to the degree which, like, the parts of DC you want to go to are walkable. All right, so we're here. We started over here. All right. So, like, to the degree which, DC does have transit deserts. Like, that is a fair statement. Probably not as severe a degree. Again, if you're able-bodied, I don't mean to be ableist. Ableism. Maybe. This car just stood out. Oh, okay. This is something else I was hoping to do. I was hoping to see if flags were actually a flat half mast, and apparently this is actually unironically a good spot for that. So they actually are. It's incredible. It's hilarious how Charlie Kirk has caused flags to be at half staff. Like, unironically, this is the national flag over there. That is genuinely hilarious if you think about it. I don't know. It's just, sometimes it's a bit too much. Like, the irony is too on the nose. Right. I don't know. It's not like Kirk was a demigod or something. Like, his gimmick, or what he did, was literally just beef with college kids, I don't know. I do suppose it's one of those things where I discount my experience. Right, because, like, you don't want to over-extrapolate your existence to something else too much of a degree. And if you don't want to